Chapter 15. Riley wondered what she had done. There was no screeching siren, no flashing blue or red lights. No lights at all, in fact. The moment she pulled the lever, all the hallway bulbs immediately blinked out. It was as if the alarm had been wired to the wrong switch, and, in pulling it, she'd managed to somehow shut off all the power to the entire school. That, or I didn't want to think about the or. She floundered there, drowning in the darkness. Her eyes adjusted as much as possible, seeking out the edges where black shifted to gray, taking in what light there was. It was still evening outside, but evening in November means the sun had set. The street lamps studded around the parking lot cast their holes like giant fireflies, illuminating the empty spaces below. A little bit of light seeped through the windows, just enough for Riley to see a few feet around her. Everything else was shadow, caught at the edge of reality and imagination. She shivered and crossed her arms, giving herself a hug. There was something innately troubling about the dark. Riley's father thought so too. It came with the job, he said. Driving a car was one thing, on the road, where lamps often stood guard against the black backdrop. But out on the tracks, chugging through the countryside, the darkness was almost total in places, save for the swath cut by the engine's headlights. The space directly in front of you was fine, but that tunnel quickly collapsed on both sides, and there was always possibility of something, a deer, a fallen tree, an oncoming car, lurking at the edge, at the bend, right at the corner where light fell into the void. So you're really afraid of the dark? She'd asked him once. I'm not afraid of the dark, he told her. I'm afraid of what's in the dark. That thought made her shiver even harder now. Riley tried to push the alarm lever back into position, thinking to undo what she'd done, but it was stuck, perhaps waiting for the key that would slide in the slot above it, a key that was held by the principal or the secretary, someone who was already at home, turning on Wheel of Fortune or taking their chicken pot pie out of the oven. Not that there was anything to shut off. She supposed it was possible that the alarm had still sent its signal to the fire station down the road. It had taken them less than 5 minutes to get to school the last time the alarm was pulled. Riley had timed them, except even as she hoped for it, wished for it. Part of her knew they weren't coming, that the alarm didn't work at all, that she had somehow only made things worse. Every attempt she made to leave was met with added resistance. For every action, a reaction. Riley's skin dimpled as a chill worked through her like an electric current. Was it just her imagination, or was it already colder in here? Riley moved back to the front doors and tried to open them again, first with the button, then with her hands. The definition of insanity, doing the same thing, expecting different results. And yet, there was a supply closet, the one with half of a dissecting needle still shoved into its knob, the one that refused to open no matter how hard she twisted or kicked, until it did. She could get out of there, but no farther? Why? None of this made any sense. Riley pressed her forehead against the door. Please, please, just let me out of here. She wasn't even sure whom she was asking, but she sensed there was someone or something out there, listening. Go ahead, say it. You know what it is. She didn't know what it was, not for certain, because what she was thinking, what she had been thinking ever since she burst through that supply closet door was impossible. In truth, Riley always liked a good ghost story. Her father did too. Her mother took responsibility for the read-alouds, sitting on the edge of the bed, her free hand resting on Riley's knee or gently rubbing her feet, ripping through Junie B. and the A to Z mysteries. When it was her father's turn to took her in, he waved off How to Train Your Dragon. Nothing against those stories. He was sure they were fantastic. He would rather make up his own. Her father only told two kinds of stories, funny and scary. I never picked the funny ones. They weren't always about ghosts. Some were about witches with knives for fingers or monsters with mouths full of serrated teeth that sank deep into your flesh to suck out the juices. Some were about shadows that stayed pressed against the wall until you looked away or fell asleep, and then crept up over your blankets, across your chin, seeping into your nostrils, your ears, sinking down your throat as you snored, worming their way into your soul and turning it black so that you woke up the next day cursed. Some were about a nest of nasty bugs, roaches and earwigs and millipedes, that formed in the attic above Riley's room, getting bigger and bigger and heavier until at some point, while she was sleeping, the nest would get too large and crash through her ceiling, blanketing her in a million skittering legs. Many of her father's stories ended in a bloodbath. He was notorious for not skipping on the gory details. Leaking entrails and eaten brains were common motifs. But Riley's favorites were the ghost stories, and her favorites of those, naturally, were the ones about trains. One told of a train that only came out on the anniversary of President Abraham Lincoln's death, traveling from Washington, D.C. to Lincoln's home in Springfield, Illinois, supposedly stopping the watches and clocks in every town it passed. That one wasn't scary so much as eerie. Another told of a passenger train that passed through a miles-long tunnel cut through a haunted mountain. The conductor had to increase his speed through the tunnel because every second spent in the darkness told took a day off your life, until one fateful night the train broke down in the middle of the mountain. Passengers felt their future days slipping away, tick by tick, ultimately running for the end of the tunnel until their old legs gave out and they turned to dust beneath them. And of course, there was the train of souls, which stopped in each and every town each and every night to collect the spirits of the dead. Some were taken to the junction where they would could transfer to their final destination, depending, Riley's father told her with a wink, on how virtuous they were in life, especially when it came to obeying their parents. But others, those whose eternities were still undecided, were forced to ride the phantom rails, a sort of limbo train, a purgatory on tracks. Some people who passed away aren't allowed to move on, he said. Something keeps them here, usually something they did while they were alive, or something they failed to do. Of course, the worst thing about the trains of souls was that you knew when your time was up. The night before your last day on Earth, just as you closed your eyes to go to sleep, you would hear the whistle, faint and far away but unmistakable, letting you know that it was coming for you, that death was on its way. It's time, the whistle said. Finishing the particular story, her father would kiss her good night and shut off her light. And as he walked down the hall, he would whistle, just loud enough for her to hear him through the walls. It always gave her the goosebumps. Then Riley rolled her eyes, because she knew the shadows always stayed stuck to the wall. She knew that witches with knives or fingers didn't exist. She knew it was always her father making those somber noises in the hallway and that the train wasn't really coming for her, that there was no train at all. Riley knew in her heart there was no such thing as ghosts. She thought about her father, wished he was standing next to her now. He would tell her she had nothing to be afraid of, that if he was here, she would believe him. But she didn't know where he was. Maybe Iowa, maybe Idaho, could be anywhere. Riley's teeth rattled. She clenched her jaw to keep them still. It really couldn't be that cold in here already. Maybe outside, where Riley could see the wind wrestling with the trees, but not here, even if the heat had gone off. She stepped back and studied the long, narrow pane of glass to the right of the door in front of her, the one she'd been looking out of. It was one solid sheet about 8 feet high and 2 feet wide, a gap she could easily squeeze through, except there was no way to open this one. No latch, no lever, no sliding back, just glass permanently set into the frame. Shatterable glass. Not a good idea. Maybe not. For standing there in the dark with who knows what lurking somewhere in this school, it was the best one she had. There would be consequences. Principal Wharton would frown when she discovered someone had put a hole in her school. But a little property damage was a small price to pay if it meant getting the holy hell out of here, and Riley was past the point of not breaking things. It was a line she'd crossed before. She would need something heavy, preferably with a point or a sharp corner, and solid, nothing that could easily bend or break. She mentally ran through the contents of the backpack still slung over her shoulders, a binder, an empty lunchbox with a plastic water bottle, a handful of ink pens, 3 new books checked out from the library, and a roll of duct tape, which her father claimed which could fix anything but a broken heart. It was handy to always have around. Maybe she could use it to tape up the window when she was done. She'd have a flashlight, one of those expensive fits in your pocket front pocket tactical types with lots of lumens and a handy wrist strap. Her mother made her carry it for walks home, even though the 3 streets she had to take were all well lit and through friendly and familiar neighborhoods. Riley fished it out of her bag and flipped it on, relieved at how well it pushed back against the darkness. The flashlight was metal and felt solid, but it was too small to do any real damage. She needed something bigger. She needed a brick or a sledgehammer. She looked around the hallway, following the spotlight of her flashlight's beam as it slid along the walls, coming to rest on a welcome sign. Welcome in, Benvenuto, Salamat Datang. And then on the sculpture sitting beneath it, a small tree made of twisted copper wire and tinfoil leaves, meant, Riley supposed, to symbolize the potential growth of every Northridge Middle School student. The title on the little gold placard on the wall called it Branching Out and said the artist was Sandra Morano, a former Northridge 8th grader. The first time Riley saw the sculpture and the sign above it, she wanted to barf, too cringy for words. This time she looked beneath the wire tree to the base that held it, a solid series chunk of stone at least a foot all around. Riley set her backpack by the door and propped her flashlight against it, angling it to provide the most light possible. She was going to need both hands for this. Her teeth had stopped chattering, at least though the hair still stood on her neck as she crossed the hall. She paused above the emblem of the Northridge Panther, remembering a time, it felt like forever ago, that she'd stopped the new girl from doing something embarrassing, something she would regret. Maybe Riley should have let her. Forget Emily. Stay focused. Hulk smash. She bent down and grabbed hold of the tree by its wiry metal trunk with one hand, lifting it just enough to get her other hand underneath it. It was even heavier than she'd expected, heavier than the paving stone she'd helped her father carry to the backyard last summer so they could build a patio. Her back strained as she wrestled the sculpture across the hall to the front door, walking hunchbacked, the tree already starting to bend at the base where it had been welded to the stone. The tinfoil leaves and sharp wire branches scratched at Riley's arm with every step, drawing tiny red lines. One good hit, she thought. One good swing. That's all it will take. break the glass, squeeze through, run home, and then she would worry about the and then when she got there. She lifted the sculpture as high as she could, arms shaking, holding the stone's square base like a shot putter, shoulder level, aiming for the center of the glass. Branching out, she thought. Riley heaved, aiming for the middle of the window. She felt a sharp sting as one of the wire leaves tore through the skin on the back of her hand, but she was too fixated on the glass to notice, anticipating the sound of it shattering, splintering into 1,000 pieces by the force of her throw. Instead, all she heard was a dull thunk as a corner of the stone struck, hitting the glass just a little off center, making a small divot barely noticeable. Riley made a sound, something close to a growl, and then looked down at the slash that zigzagged its way from the base of her thumb clear to her wrist. Bright blood bubbled like lava all on the crack, and it suddenly hurt with a razor-sharp pain. She stuck the back of her hand in her mouth, pressing her tongue against her skin and licking away the blood, then shaking her arms as if she could somehow whisk the hurt away. The blood quickly returned, smearing along her hand and down her wrist. It was deeper than she thought. In the faint light from outside, Riley examined the mark the stone pedestal had made in the glass. Then she remembered. 2 years ago, after yet another horrific school shooting 3 states away, they had taken steps to make Northridge safer, including installing bulletproof glass in all the doors and windows. Sculpture-proof too, apparently. She could try again, except it had nearly broken her back to lift and throw the thing the first time, and all she had to show for it was a bloody gash in her hand and a chip in the glass smaller than one of Mrs. Griswold's dimples. And with the possibility, too hard to ignore, that no matter what she tried, Riley wasn't going to find a way out of here. Exits locked, phone's not working, fire alarm busted, glass impenetrable, power and lights and all out. 2 tries, 20 tries. What if it didn't make a difference? I don't know, Horatio. Maybe she should just wait right here, camp out in the front lobby right by the office, curl up with her backpack and flashlight in bloody hand next to the mangled metal tree and under the watchful eye of the Northridge Panther, and wait for rescue. Some teacher coming in early to finish grading would find the 13-year-old girl balled up and shivering in the corner. Or maybe her mother, finally slogging home after a 10-hour shift, would find an empty house and call the police. Eventually, someone would retrace Riley's steps, track her down to her last known location. She only had to wait it out. Except there was still the matter of the dead frog, and the graffiti on the bathroom door, the window crashing down, nearly severing her fingers, and the cut on her hand, bleeding freely, dripping down to her wrist into the cuff of her sweatshirt. There's no easy out, Riley. Some things you just have to face head on. That was what her father would say. Her mother would tell her to take care of this nasty cut first. Riley decided she would listen to them both for once. Chapter 17. Some days it felt like she would never get out of this place. Like the bright green exit sign mocked her with empty promises. You can leave, sure, but we'll be back the very next day, and the day after that, and over for what felt like eternity. The end of last year had been rough, that last month especially. By April, Emily was already sitting with the volleyball girl squad at lunch, spending her weekends playing pickup games with them at the park, while Riley spent her weekends binging on Netflix and Nutella, ignoring her mother's pleas to get up off the couch and go outside. At school, she'd already checked out for the summer, failing to turn in assignments and barely scraping by on tests, counting the minutes and then the seconds until the next bell rang and she could start counting down again. The first week of May, she was sent to Wharton's office for telling Randall Willis, a little too loudly perhaps, to stop kicking the back of her mother blanking chair. Of course, it was suggested that the next time Riley could simply scoot her chair up a little rather than drop the F-bomb in the middle of math class during a quiz, especially since Randall claimed he wasn't doing it on purpose. It was a bald-faced lie, of course. He'd done it to get a rise out of her, and it worked. He could barely hide his laughter as Miss Richards rolled her out the pink pass. Then, finally, mercifully, summer arrived. Letty spent a few weeks at the Y making clay pots and temporary acquaintances. She tried and failed to learn how to play tennis. She badly burned her shoulders falling asleep on the patio and spent hours picking at the dead white skin, removing layer after layer, as if hoping to reveal a different version of herself. Her parents managed to coordinate enough days off to take her to Michigan to spend a week on the lake, where she drank bottled root beer and furtively took pictures of older boys on her phone to look at later, all while pretending that summer was infinite and that seventh grade would never come. But June too quickly gave way to July, which too easily melted into August. The first day of school looming, her mother promised again that it would be better this year, but only if you set out to make it better. Riley thought of kittens with their heads stuck in glass, but she promised herself she'd at least try. So the night before the first day, Riley sat down at her little wooden desk, took out a sheet of paper, and scrawled the words, "the plan," at the top. It wasn't really a plan. Plans have steps, a natural progression, one thing leading to the next. This was more of a to-do list, a short one. Make friends. Get nothing lower than a B in any of my classes. Try out for a sport, not tennis. Don't lose my temper, don't get in trouble. When the first day of school started, Riley arrived with her list tucked into the front pocket of her backpack, folded into a neat little square. Any part of the plan that wasn't really a plan that she pulled off would be a great a check mark. Failures would get crossed out. She wanted all check marks, of course, but she'd be happy with just get majority. The first item on the list proved difficult. Riley was never good at making friends. She wasn't like her mother, bursting with energy and easy conversation, chatting up patients she'd just met like they'd known each other for years. Instead, she took after her father, who was content to spend whole days with nothing but his thoughts and the endless stretches of track laid out before him. And it wasn't as if there weren't lines of kids forming in the hallways waiting for Riley to bless them with her quick wit and spot-on wall expressions. The closest she'd come to claiming victory here were the girls who'd let her sit with them at lunch and one boy named Sham, who sometimes waved to her in social studies. None exactly friends, amiable acquaintances, really worth a half a check mark. Item 2 should have been easier, except Mrs. Schweitz bored her to tears and caused her to space out about halfway through every class, all amounting to a very low C for her first quarter in math. Item 3 was kind of a long shot anyway. The moment she walked onto the field during soccer tryouts and saw how good the other girls were already, she turned around and came home. She didn't need the added embarrassment of the whispers that would come with her with being the worst player on the team. But even those were all still better than the last two items on the list, the ones that had been crossed out since the second week of school. The day some girl named Amber Forsyth started saying mean things about Riley behind her back. That was kind of a she was kind of a freak, a weirdo who lost it in class, which was probably why she didn't have any friends. Not anymore anyway. Riley waited until lunch to let Amber know how she felt. Calmly retrieved her playful spaghetti with an extra ladle's worth of meat sauce. She hunted down Amber sitting with her friends and accidentally dropped the entire thing of pasta in the girl's lap, the watery red sauce seeping into the girl's expensive-looking jeans. The scream was deafening. Item 5 was crossed out approximately 30 seconds after item 4, with another pink slip to the principal's office. By November, the plan had changed. The folded square of paper no longer took up space in Riley's backpack, having been replaced with a roll of duct tape and a flashlight, both of which proved infinitely more practical than a list of personal goals. The new plan consisted of one word, one that Riley didn't even bother to write down because she didn't need to. It was the word she whispered to herself every day when she walked through the double doors into Northridge Middle School. When it came right down to it, there was only one word that mattered: survive. Chapter 18. She had a plan. It wasn't a good plan, she knew, but it was better than curling up in a corner waiting for rescue. That wasn't the girl her parents raised. Her father tamed a 20,000-ton behemoth raging along a set of skinny rails at 40 miles an hour. He had a 50-item checklist memorized, everything he had to inspect and verify before one of his trains moved so much as an inch. Her mother could reach a diagnosis faster than half of the doctors she worked under. They taught Riley how to attack the problem, to study the angles, to eliminate options of lesser worth, and then, when the best course of action revealed itself, to commit. The plan was simple. She would walk through the entire school, starting with A Hall and working her way around to D Hall and then back. She would try every exit she came across. There were at least 11, she knew, and she'd only tried 2 so far. It was important to rule out every possibility. That's what Mr. Bardem would say. She would also look into every open classroom, flip on every light switch, try every window, try dialing out on every phone. She would be systematic. She would exhaust all her options. But first, she had to address the nasty cut trailing blood down the length of her arm. Nurse's office neighbored the main office, but of course it was locked. Always. You don't leave a cabinet full of Adderall and Ritalin, not to mention enough shots of epinephrine for all the nut allergy kids to jumpstart a hippo's heart, unattended with middle schoolers roaming around. Nurse Gardner also had a drawer full of bandages in every size you could imagine, but since Riley couldn't get to them, she had to improvise. The Northridge cafeteria was huge. That had been Riley's belly fluttering impression of the first time she saw it. It was at least 3 times the size of the one at elementary school. 40 octagonal tables sat in staggered rows, each one sitting up to 8 kids, or sometimes just 3 Mongol-loving girls and one half-interested bystander. For most, for most, lunch was the best period of the day, but not for Riley. It was somehow easier to blend in the classroom, where half the kids were fixated on the teacher and the other half were in a trance or full-on sleeping. The cafeteria was different. It was like the Wild West. Anything could happen. She briefly pictured Amber Forsyth's horrified face, her hands holding clumps of spaghetti like bloody entrails. Not Riley's fault. The girl had it coming. All the hallway lights were out now, so Riley followed the beacon of a flashlight beam, thanking her mother for insisting that she carry it and wishing that she hadn't pulled the fire alarm, though she still couldn't fathom how that could have shut off the school's electricity. Didn't they have backup generators in case of a power surge? Weren't there fail-safe mechanisms in place? Yeah, probably, under normal circumstances. And under normal circumstances, the doors open and the windows stay up and the frogs stay dead. Under normal circumstances, Riley would be finished with dinner by now. But Riley knew she was a long way from normal. As she moved down the hall, she noticed how different the school appeared in the silent gloom. In the light, with the din of a few hundred students in the background, the building was sort of strangely comforting, comforting in its tedious familiarity. Now it seemed alien to her. Darkness was deceiving. Sometimes it seemed to expand the emptiness of the hallways, stretching them not so out so that the room became like branching caverns in some subterranean maze. Other times it closed everything off, the hallways growing thinner, the walls pressing in on her from both sides, the ceiling, ba the ceiling bearing down so that Riley had to stop and catch her breath, taking away the illusion that the whole school was caving in. The, perv the pervading silence made her own noise more intense. The sound of her boots slapping the hard floor pounded in her ears. The audible whisper of her breathing, the scritch of the backpack shifting against her sweatshirt. A cough crackled like a gunshot in the darkness when there was no one else around. Riley slowed her pace, taking car-like steps, as if she was sneaking up on someone, or was afraid of someone sneaking up on her. The flashlight beam caught glimpses of things, lockers, posters, doorways, which, when isolated, seemed slightly out of place, like a puzzle where a handful of pieces had been forced into the wrong spots. Cafeteria was pitch black, no windows to let in even the slightest seepage of outside light. Riley wondered if the refrigerators and freezers in the kitchen now lacked power as well. What a cluster that would be come morning. She tried to imagine what the cafeteria ladies would say when they showed up to find pre-thawed mystery meat and sweaty cartons of spoiled milk. What were any of them going to say, Riley wondered. What was Mr. Barnum going to say when he walked into his supply closet and found the mess she made breaking out? Or Principal Wharton discovering the school's beloved copper wire tree sculpture in a mangled heap by the front entrance? What would she tell them? What was she going to tell her parents? No matter what she said, she wasn't sure they would believe her. How could they? She wasn't even sure she believed what to believe. One thing at a time, Riley Flynn. Take care of your hand first. Riley swept her flashlight across the metal partition that bared across the counter after hours. No chance of her sneaking into the kitchen. That was fine. All she needed was some bandaging material and a little hand sanitizer, and the cafeteria had both. She grabbed a handful of brown napkins from the counter by the tray drop-off and took them to the Purell dispenser, which seemed to be the only thing in the school still working. She soaked one of the napkins in sanitizer and then closed her eyes. This was going to sting. Thought of her mother, Amanda Flynn, didn't believe in kiss and make it better. When Riley fell down and gently scraped a knee or banged an elbow, her mother would inspect it and then give her prognosis, which is almost always, I think you'll live. Riley supposed she couldn't blame her. Her mom had seen 10-year-olds dying from cancer, held their sweaty hands while their own bodies betrayed them. She spent her days in the intensive care unit with patients who were right on the edge, passengers listening for the train whistle, wondering if this was their stop. If Riley wasn't bleeding and or broken, her mother grabbed a tissue, told her to wipe her nose, and suggested being more careful. If Riley had been crying especially hard, she got a hug. Pick yourself up. You brush yourself off. You get back to business. Riley pressed a napkin against the cut, feeling it suddenly catch fire, burning all the way down to her fingertips. That's how you know it's working, her mom would say. Riley blew on the wound and wiped it clean, then pressed another folded napkin along the length of the cut, 2 inches from the web of her thumb down to her wrist. She found the closest table and sat down to fish through her backpack, angling her flashlight so that she could see. The duct tape was at the bottom. She tore off a strip with her teeth and then wrapped it around her hand twice, careful not to make it too tight or to restrict her thumb movement any more than necessary. She wanted to be able to make a fist if she had to, just in case. She secured her bandage with another swatch of tape and flexed her fingers. Riley took a moment to admire her handiwork in the flashlight's beam. Perfectly serviceable. Her mother would be proud. She stuffed the roll of tape back in her bag. Bring on the broken heart, she whispered, and snorted laughter to herself. The sound echoed in the cafeteria. Listened to it bounce off the ceiling and the walls. The darkness was messing with her senses. The emptiness made everything louder. Riley listened to her absurd little laugh fade away. And then, inexplicably, it echoed again, except more drawn out this time, longer and louder. Riley froze. This wasn't her laugh. It sounded strange, more of a tittering, a mocking sound. In fact, it didn't sound like just one person laughing at all. It was made up of multiple voices, several laughs blended together. It started in one corner of the room and carried to the other side, jumping from table to table. There was no joy in it. It was cruel, smug, dismissive, the kind of snickering that hooks into a middle schooler's ears like barbed wire. Letty spun in her seat, flashlight in hand, light leaping around, finding the corners, dancing across the tables. Cafeteria was empty. Hello? Is somebody there? A few ticks of silence passed, and then the laughter started up again, coming from her left this time, jeering, needling, sharp. She spun the other way as it whipped around and then came at her from the right, which meant she was in the center. She was hearing it everywhere now, steadily growing in volume, shifting in pitch, multiple voices overlapping, laughter of boys and girls both. It danced and gimbaled, seeming to hit her from whatever angle she wasn't looking at, always, inexplicably, right behind her, sneaking up on her. Then she would turn and it would disappear, only to circle around again, everywhere at once. Riley stood up, grabbing her backpack with her unbandaged hand. The laughter enveloped her, growing louder and louder until her head started to ring. She dropped her bag and put both hands to her ears, pressing them right. Stop it, she yelled. but her voice was lost among the cacophony of 100 other voices, determined, it seemed, to drown her out, all of them laughing at her. She turned to run, flashlight beam aimed at the floor, nearly stepping on the not-so-deadish frog jumping right into her path. Chapter 19. The goal was always to get her to jump or at least give her the heebie-jeebies. Riley wasn't easily frightened, which meant her dad had to work at it. He sometimes turned off all her lights when he told her his stories, using the flashlight on his phone to illuminate his face, which often took on grotesque shapes when a villain appeared, twisting it into the leering grin of a luring witch or the squinting-eyed grimace of a bloodthirsty vampire. With the ghost stories, he would keep the phone pursed under his chin, giving off just enough light to cast him in an ominous, sickly yellow glow. There was more than one kind of ghost story, of course. Riley's father could recite a couple dozen off the top of his head, and could make up a new one on the spot when the mood struck him. Some were scarier than others, but to Riley at least, they all seemed to have one thing in common. Underneath the thrills and chills, they carried a hint of sadness. At the start, they made her shiver underneath her embroidered bedspread, but by the end, the anxiety had faded, leaving a kind of heaviness in her heart. She said as much one night, and her father pulled her covers to her chin. Well, of course they're sad, he told her. They're ghost stories. Ghost stories are all about loss, about getting left behind, which is pretty scary if you think about it. I'm not afraid, she told him, which wasn't entirely true. Some of her father's stories actually did give her nightmares, though she wouldn't dare tell him so, afraid he would stop. I'm not talking about you, monster. I know you're not scared. I'm talking about the ghosts. What does a ghost have to be afraid of? Same thing as everybody, I suppose, her father said. They're afraid of being forgotten. Riley said that was stupid. Why would a ghost even care? Nobody wants to be forgotten, her father replied. There was one story he told about a square wicker basket that wasn't scary at all. The couple had just gotten married. The husband was flighty, scatterbrained, always forgetting where he put things. So the wife brought a basket to keep on the counter by the sink and nagged the husband endlessly to put everything important, anything he would need, inside it for easy finding. Where is my, he would start to say, and she would answer with, check the basket. Even when the wife got leukemia and the husband spent much of his time taking care of her, she still reminded him about the basket where he kept his keys and wallet as well as her growing medical bills and medications. The wife's condition deteriorated, and 6 years after buying the house and the wicker basket, her body succumbed and was buried in a cemetery miles away, but her spirit remained. Her husband knew this because whenever he misplaced something, his cell phone, his watch, television remote, he would ransack the house, stopping around in frustration, looking in all the usual places, including the basket by the sink. The first time he checked it, of course, the thing he was looking for was never in it. Only when he came back to the kitchen later and opened the basket one last time would he find it there, waiting for him, a little reminder of what he'd lost for good. That's how it worked. Sometimes a ghost power manifested itself into a particular object, an old pair of reading glasses that allowed a woman to see her long-lost lover, a fireplace that crackled and spat with a constant orange flame even though there was no logs to burn, keeping a family warm after their father passed, a piano that played a young girl's favorite piece in the middle of the night for her bereaved parents, a bathtub that would fill itself in the house of a boy who drowned. These objects were often the source of a ghost power. They were also the anchors that kept the spirits of the dead from moving on. A ghost is only as strong as the memories that keep it here. What that meant for Riley, of course, was that a ghost could be anything. The static of an old television set, the silence on the other end of the phone, a lock of hair that appears in a brush that hasn't been used in years, footprints in the freshly vacuumed carpet, the window that opens in the middle of the night to be let in fitful dreams. Ghosts aren't always floating sheets of whisper of smoke, right? As Dad told her. They take on many forms. You might see them in the shimmer of a puddle or the reflection from a window. You can see them in a bird that perches on your mailbox every morning. Sometimes you don't even see them at all, but you still know they're there. You can feel it in your house, in the way your hair stands up on the back of your neck, in a tickle that starts all the way down at your feet. Then, of course, the hand Riley hadn't been watching, the rough, calloused engineer's hand that was twice the size of her own, would slip under the covers by her feet and tickle her toes. Riley would scream and jump and tell him to quit it before begging him to tell her another story. A scary one this time. Not another sad one. Something bloody, with cannibals. Better yet, zombies. Because, in truth, those kinds of stories never stayed scary for long. They were too ridiculous. Good for a cheap thrill, but easily forgotten. Not like the ghost stories. Those were the ones that lingered. Sort of like the ghosts themselves. Chapter 20. It had to be the same one as before. One half eviscerated zombie frog looks much the same as another, Riley thought, but you remember the patterning, the collage of black spots, especially up around the nose and eyes, eyes that were looking up at her in the pull of the flashlight's beam. So, ribbit? Riley choked down her scream this time. She had enough self-control not to send the creature soaring through the air with her boot again, either. The frog stood in the entryway as if trying to block her way, though she could have easily have stepped right over him. Except she wasn't sure she could move. Her feet felt like they'd been welded to the floor. Behind her, the raucous laughter had faded, enough that she'd been able to hear the dead frog speak. No, not speak wasn't quite the right word for it. Rather, it wasn't sure it actually made any sound. The frog's voice seemed like it came from inside and outside all at once, almost as if Riley had thought it rather than heard it. As if the frog had opened up her brain and spilled the words inside, bypassing her ears entirely. The frog's throat bulged the way bullfrogs do when they send out a mating call. That Mr. Bardem had said these were grass frog specimens, and the sound that came to her wasn't an animal croak. It sounded like a grown man's voice. It sounded like, almost like her father. Please kick me again, the frog pleaded. Last time, I'm pretty sure something came loose. Huh? Riley's own voice sounded foggy to her, phlegmy and hoarse. The shriveled creature adjusted itself on its hind legs, and she could see the two peeled flaps of its belly hanging down, the incision that started from just beneath the throat. A reminder that it was long gone, or should be. I understand. You're scared, but I promise I'm not here to hurt you, and it makes it hard to have a conversation when one of us is flying across the room. The voice in her head paused and then added, I'm Max, by the way. Max Trotter. And you are? Crazy. That's what she was. Actually crazy. Like double backflip off the high dive into the deep end of Nutsville. Riley dug her knuckles into her temples as if the pressure might release some insanity valve in her brain. At least the laughter in the cafeteria had finally subsided, and even the echo of the empty room seemed to have lessened, though Riley felt like the frog's, Max's, voice still had a resonant quality, like it pinballed around inside her skull. You talk, she said, ignoring the question. You're talking. More or less, Max said. But you're a freaking frog, Raya said, louder. A dead frog, she thought, but let's take this one sticky step at a time. Yeah, sort of. At least in body, if not, you know. Riley shook her head. She hadn't been hallucinating before, she definitely was now. Her mother was right. In times of stress, you see things that aren't really there. Phantom trains on the tracks, flashing lights in the sky, floating sheets and wisps of smoke. Maybe she'd have a nervous breakdown during the hour that she'd had been locked in that supply closet, and this was the result. She took a step back and fell into a seat at the table, shaking her head, but keeping the eye of the flashlight trained on the frog. This can't be real. This can't be real. The frog took a couple of labored hops toward her, and Riley recoiled instinctively, muscles tense, boot ready to strike out again. Though the creature didn't look dangerous, it looked as if its hind leg had been hurt. It rested at an awkward angle. I already told you, you aren't crazy, he said. This has a dead frog, Riley whispered to herself. Maybe she was just seeing things and hearing things, but she could smell him too, mixed with chemicals and the underlying ripeness, the sickening sweet scent of slow decay. Could you hallucinate a smell and a voice? Could you imagine all these things at once? The frog reached up with a foreleg and scratched its nose. It was an oddly human gesture. No, impossible. You're just in my head, Ray said. You're not real. You're not imagining me. I wish you were. Trust me when I say I don't want to be here any more than you do. I could be imagining you telling me that I'm not imagining you, Ray countered. That cut in your hand doesn't look too imaginary, the frog said. Probably doesn't feel imaginary either. Riley glanced at her bandaged hand. You could already see a little red stripe soaking through the brown napkin. He was right. The pain felt real bad. Real enough. But you can't be, this isn't, I mean, just look at you. The frog's eyes moved in all directions as if he was trying to do just that. Sorry, he finally said. I thought it might be easier for you to handle if you had an actual body to talk to. Something substantial, and this was the best vessel I could get. If you'd like, I can probably go find a cockroach or something, or a spider, but some people are afraid of spiders. Riley shook her head. She thought back to the bag on the floor in Bardem's supply closet, the one she'd taken the probing needle from, the one that had twitched and jumped the moment just before he managed to bust through the door. Well, that's not you. I mean, if you're not really, a frog. Riley swallowed hard, determined to finish her question. Then what the hell are you? Max blinked up at her. You know what I am. I don't know, Horatio. Maybe not. Or maybe so. Riley put her hands up. She leaned back in her chair. Her voice shook. No, no way. She stood up, but the voice in her head grew more pressing. I get it. Believe me, it took me a while to adjust to the fact, too. Let's face it, I'm not the only strange thing you've seen or heard around here. The frog's eyeballs glanced around the room again, taking in the cafeteria that less than a minute ago had been filled with derisive laughter. Riley thought of the sounds coming from the girls' restroom, all the doors that wouldn't open, the lights suddenly shutting off. The frog was right. It wasn't the only strange thing, just the strangest. You know what I am. She shook her head. All those bedtime stories. She knew they weren't real, but she'd asked for her father anyway. Wait, you think I'm just making this stuff up? He'd say, and then he would wink at her, and then would be in on the joke. He'd blow her a kiss and flip off her light, and she would watch his shadow move, pausing in the doorway, back to her, head slightly cocked. Then again, you can never be too sure, he said. She was sure. She had been sure. She wasn't so sure. The frog bowed up and down. I know how you feel, and I don't blame you, but I can help. I know what you're going through, and I can help you get out of here. At least I think I can. But you have to promise to help me too. Get out of here. The same words she'd been shouting in her own head since the moment he was locked in that closet, with the very same frog. Riley cocked her head. Help you? Max rose up, lifting his chin, exposing more of his tattered belly. For starters, you could patch me up so I'm not tripping over my own guts anymore. Then afterwards, we can talk. The frog glanced left, then right. But not here. This place gives me the creeps. Gives you the creeps? Riley thought to herself, but then she recalled the laughter that had surrounded her only moments ago. She wasn't sure he would ever get out of her head. So how about it? Do you want my help or not? I don't know, Horatio. She pictured her father sitting on the edge of her bed, the sly wink, the break in the facade. There's no such thing as ghosts. Then again, nothing seems real to you until you've had the chance to see it, hear it, touch it. Unless he's staring up at you with his empty eyes, proving you wrong. Chapter 21. Riley had little direct experience with death. She was the kind of girl who gently guided spiders into paper cups to take them outside. The kind who would find a twig to carefully move earthworms that surfaced from the rain-soaked earth and lay sprawled across the sidewalk back into the grass so they could be switched under the bicycle's tread. She'd been a vegetarian from the age of 8, minus one McDonald's-fueled relapse brought about by stress, in which she laid waste to a 20-count of nuggets, though they would later get their revenge. When she was little, she would try to pet the bumblebees that circled the tiny flower garden she tended with her mother. That also was a mistake. Only one of her grandparents had passed during her lifetime, her father's father, but she was 3 and had no memory of the funeral. Her one and only solid memory of Grandpa Gage was of him going crazy with a can of spray whipped cream, giving both her and himself delicious, dripping Santa Claus beers and laughing like lunatics. He died suddenly, a brain aneurysm, while sitting on his porch doing the daily jumble. It was, Riley thought, a good way to go. Outside of Grandpa Gage, Riley had never personally known anyone who passed. She never even lost a pet because she never had one to lose. With her parents' schedules, it was difficult to give a dog the attention it deserved, and her father was allergic to cats. But none of that stopped her from trying. She brought home every living thing she could find in the small woods 3 blocks from her house with the hopes that she could keep it. Garter snakes that she snatched barehanded, crickets and caterpillars captured in jars, buckets of tadpoles that never turned into frogs, or, in turn, princes. In a moment of desperation, she adopted a garden sled that she'd found attached to her bedroom window. She was always told to put them back where she found them, and she always did, except for the slug, which she set on a rock in the shade, assuming it would be happier there. Then, last summer, her father brought in from the yard a young rabbit, barely more than a kit. It had burrowed beneath one of the hedges and was fortunate that he hadn't caught it with the trimmer, though it was clear something else had already gotten a piece of it. The neighbor's husky, perhaps. Blood matted its fur, and patches of skin had been roughly torn, revealing the muscle twitching underneath. Its right ear was half chewed off, its back leg broken. Riley's ears broke just looking at it. Ear broke just looking at it. Heart. Her mother, the nurse, was at work, so it was up to Dad and Riley to care for the frightened, damaged thing. They cleaned it off as best they could, disinfecting the wounds with hydrogen peroxide. The rabbit thrashed, but Riley's father had a strong grip and wouldn't let go until the job was done. They wrapped the back leg, splitting it with half a popsicle stick from Riley's craft supply box, then her father let her hold it. It was small enough that she could practically cup it with both hands, with only its head peeking out. She could feel its tiny heart pulsing rapidly beneath its fur, still slick from antiseptic. She could feel its heart. Its small, solemn eyes seemed to swallow the whole world at once. Riley stroked the top of its head, careful to avoid the damaged ear. Its whiskers tickled her fingers. All at once, Riley felt something surge inside her, a deep connection to this broken thing that had been chased, attacked, abandoned. This creature who was scared and lonely and lost. And so, when her father returned with a shoebox and opened lid, Riley shook her head. We need to keep it. We need to take care of ourselves. Riley, it's a wild animal, not a pet. Its legs is busted and it got cut and scrapes all over. It could already have a serious infection. We need to take it to the wildlife rehabilitation center. They will know what to do. But I want to help it, she said, her breath hitching, holding in her ears because it seemed silly for an almost teenager to cry over something like this. Her dad wrapped his arm around her as she wrapped hers around the rabbit, layer upon layer, squeezing just tight enough. You are helping it. We can only do so much, and this is more than we can handle. He covered her small hands with his giant ones, taking the trembling, twitching ball of fur and placing it gently in the box, quickly covering it with the lid. The wildlife center is a bit of a drive. You hold on tight to the box, okay? Riley sniffed and nodded. She would take what she could get. For the next 25 minutes, at least, she had a pet rabbit, albeit one that she couldn't hold or see or hear, but that she could feel the weight of it on her lap, the weight of the living thing that is counting on you. That was almost too much to bear. And yet, heavy as it was, when the woman was at the wildlife center, held out her hand for the box, Riley couldn't barely let go of it. 22. First, she had to take care of him, like the poor rabbit that her father had dragged in last summer. She helped Max, and Max helped her. That was the deal. Riley looked at the frog sitting in the center of the desk, the beamer flashlight encircling him like a Broadway star. They were in one of the classrooms now, just down the hall from the cafeteria. He'd asked her to carry him because it would be faster that way, but she shook her head. She wasn't about to touch it. Him. Not with her bare hands. Afraid of getting warts? His voice echoed. Riley didn't answer. Warts were pretty far down the list of things she was currently scared of. Still, she set her backpack on the ground and unzipped their front pouch, shaking her head in continued disbelief that she was taken to a dead frog, and that he was talking back. Hop in. Funny, he said. He wasn't trying to be. She saw no humor in any of this. Max struggled, the one leg limp and uncooperative, but he managed to get settled in the pocket, turning to poke his nose out. Riley shouldered the backpack slowly, careful not to jostle him too much, and headed for the first room she could find, grateful to be getting away from the cafeteria with his lingering memory of laughter, but wondering what in God's name she just agreed to and who in the heavens she was toting around. Now the frog sat up on the desk in front of her, much closer than before. Riley could see the webbing on his front feet, the shifting patterns of the spots marching down his back. From the top down, he didn't look so bad. Only at eye level could you see his guts hanging out. Don't worry, I won't feel much, and this guy definitely isn't going to feel it. I'm guessing his soul hit the road a while ago. His soul. Did frogs even have souls? Riley thought of her father's phantom train, whistling its warning to oncoming passengers, the ones who wouldn't make it through the next day. One-way ticket to froggy heaven. That's how it worked, right? This body turns to dust and the spirit transcends. Unless you're one of the ones stranded in the station somewhere in between. Unless you're, just say it, Riley. Unless you're a ghost. Riley didn't believe in ghosts. Of course, belief was a funny thing. At one time, she'd been convinced that fairies trafficked in human teeth and that portly, white-bearded men with rosy cheeks broke into people's houses, leaving them gifts in exchange for carrots and cookies. At one time, she'd believed that every person you meet is basically good inside, and that friends always keep other friends' secrets, and that adults would never hurt children. She believed you always apologized for the mistakes you made and that lying was always wrong. Then she started to grow up. She believed all those things once. There was no reason she couldn't suddenly believe something that she didn't have before. And after all, there was the evidence, this ghost thing, staring right at her, talking to her. Haunting me? A thing with a name, capable of inhabiting the dead, damaged body of a dissected frog. What had he called it? A vessel? It sounded like an old word, full of antiquity and ritual. It reminded Riley of a museum she'd gone to once that had a sarcophagus of some pharaoh on display. Scattered around in it were jars of limestone that supposedly held the dead man's lungs and liver and stomach, vessels. It's that Max's stomach and liver were on full display thanks to the incision straight down his middle. No, not his exactly. This body was a loner. He was borrowing it, animating it like a puppeteer. If he could control this frog, did that mean he could control other things, inanimate things, like windows, like doors? Could he somehow manipulate the phones, the lights? Could he somehow take control of her? Does it hurt? Max asked, breaking Riley's train of thought. It still freaked her out the way that he could talk to her without making any sound, projecting his voice straight into her brain. What? Your hand. Looks like a nasty scratch. Riley shrugged. Not as bad as yours, she thought. It might leave a scar, Max added. The deep ones usually do. The comment took her by surprise. From everything she'd ever read or seen, ghosts didn't talk in complete sentences. They moaned or wailed. They screamed like banshees. They rattled chains. They didn't inquire about your well-being. They didn't make jokes about warts. None of the ghosts in her father's stories had a sense of humor. It's fine, she said. At least it was something she could do something about, something she could fix, though undoubtedly her mother would have done a better job of it. Right now, she would have endured 100 such scratches of her being stuck here with this creature, whatever it was. You said your name was Max? Was Max. Is Max. I'm not quite sure what tense you'd use it in this situation. What tense to use, Riley repeated. Not just a ghost, but a ghost concerned with both grammar. And I guess, who were you? The frog lifted one leg up to give Riley a better look at his flopping innards dangling free. Patch me up and I'll tell you. Right. Riley scanned the dark, finding a box of tissues hiding in the dark corner. Duct tape in her bag would easily patch up what was left of Max's vessel, but the tissues would keep her from having to touch the frog, ghost frog directly. Flip over, she ordered. Max blinked at her, not sure that's how frogs work. Riley exhaled slowly, channeling her mother's sense of composure. She grabbed a pencil from the cup on the desk and nestled the eraser underneath the creature's wrinkled body, and quickly jerked upward, turning him on his back. Legs splayed out next to him. Looked like he was sleeping. Or dead. Good one, Riley, she thought, freaking hilarious. Still using the soft end of the pencil, she gently pushed the frog's deflated bladder back into its body cavity. She recognized all the digestive organs instantly from the video. See, Mr. Bardem? No dissection necessary. I'm an expert. This really doesn't hurt? She asked. I can barely feel it, the upside-down frog said. Pain works differently now. But you can still feel pain? There are different kinds of pain, Max replied, and some are so much worse than others. Riley scooped the rest of the tray and intestines in. She couldn't believe what she was doing, it was saying. Her hands trembled, the pencil quivered. One of the frog's back legs, the non-grippy one, suddenly twitched, causing Riley's knees to jerk, banging against the bottom of the desk, a very real, visceral pain shooting up her leg. A curse shot out of her mouth. Sorry, Max said. Reflex. You almost done? Am I done? Oh yeah, I am so done. I was done the moment they locked me in that closet. I am absolutely over all of this. Yeah, almost, what she said. Riley nudged both flaps of skin back into place, meeting in the center, revealing a cut as long as the one on her hand. Except hers was still bleeding. Max's veins were pumped full of rubber. Using a second tissue as a bandage, she wrapped one long piece of duct tape around the creature's midsection, securing it to itself. Then she flipped him back over, careful to only touch the tape. The dead, possessed, haunted, demonic frog took a tentative test hop, then another. The tape held everything in place, though the one back leg still dragged a little. Better than the last guy that tried to fix me, he said. The last guy? Had a heart attack, Max said. Ollie thought of her grandfather sitting on the porch, newspaper in hand. Did this frog just tell me it had a heart attack? So that's how Ollie's voice trailed off. She couldn't quite bring herself to say it. The frog scratched right at his nose again. Bite the big one? Yep, that's how. The ripe old age of 45, right in the middle of the produce aisle. I was picking out an avocado, and then, bam, down. Sharp pain in my chest, couldn't breathe. My vision clouded. I caught glimpses of people hovering, shouting. Some got next to me, pounding away, but it was no use. I felt everything just sort of stop for a moment. The whole world went dark, and then when I woke up, I was here. Not in body, of course, but definitely here. Wait, like I said, here? Like, here? She shook her head, telling me you died and went to middle school? It was quite possibly the most absurd thing she'd ever heard. Not exactly my idea of heaven either, Max replied. I wasn't given much of a choice. I just found myself stuck here, trapped, kind of like you. Riley took one hard look at the frog, the broken vessel. Her hands had started trembling again. Her head, her head swam. It was just too much. Are you okay? Am I okay? Riley repeated, shaking her head slowly, her volume steadily escalating. How in the world am I supposed to be okay? I'm stuck in this freaking school, freezing in the freaking dark, talking to a freaking frog who's also a freaking ghost. Nothing about this is even remotely okay. This is seriously messed up. She let her head fall into her hands. I'm so messed up, she added softer. Max took a little hop toward her. It's not you, trust me, he said. Riley forced herself to take a long, shivered breath. The frog settled himself on his shoulders. The tape pulled right around him like a girdle. He looked up at it from the desk. We made a deal, he said. You help me, I help you. So let's have it. What do you want to know? 23. It's a loaded question, but she asked anyway. It was the day of middle school orientation. Ryder's entire fifth grade class had piled onto a bus and ridden the 15 minutes to Northridge to get a feel of the place. They'd already spent an hour fidgeting and secretly texting through speeches in the auditorium from one principal, Teresa Wharton, a buttoned-up, deep-voiced woman with short blonde hair and dangly earrings meant to show off her fun, spontaneous side, and a song from the eighth grade choir that clearly didn't want to be there. There were brochures and handouts and bookmarks and the promise of punch and cookies. Everything had the Northridge Panther growling menacingly on it. But before they could feast, the students were all broken into small groups and given a tour of the school by one of its current inmates. The building itself was huge, sprawling, so many different hallways branching off each other that it felt like a maze. Riley used to like making mazes when she was younger, a hobby of hers until it wasn't. This place seemed confusing and intimidating, and it made her head spin as she tried to keep track of which hall was which. Thankfully, Riley's tour guide was funny and approachable, surprisingly blunt, doing her best to make her gaggle of fifth graders feel comfortable. This is the gym. Physical education isn't elective here. I didn't take it because who wants to be sweaty and gross for the rest of the day? This is cafeteria. We have more choices here than the elementary schools, but none of them are that great. Chicken fingers are okay if you drown them in ranch, and on Tuesdays we get a taco bar. This is D Hall, sort of the butthole of the building. They stick all the foreign language classes back here. The lockers never get used. I'm not even sure they still work. This is the music room. If you decide to play an instrument, pick something that's easy to carry home, like the flute. I play the oboe. Don't play the oboe. It's impossible. The guide was an eighth grader with frizzy black hair and knee-high boots. Her name was Maya. In addition to her honest appraisal of the school, she also mentioned that she had a boyfriend and a pet dog, and that dog was cuter. She stood at least a foot taller than the most fifth graders who followed her. Of course, all the middle schoolers looked enormous to Riley. Maya also looked especially happy, probably all in act. But even as she talked about the terrible food or the amount of homework, she smiled as if to say that this was all worth it. That life at Northridge Middle School was manageable, that the signs in the front of the school in 12 different languages were, in fact, beckoning them to the underworld. After the tout, they stopped back in the gym and sat around Maya in a circle, crisscross applesauce, staring up in awe at her, like she was some kind of preteen idol. So, she said, time for some tea. What do you want to know? Some of the kids in Riley's group shot up hands, and Maya began called on them in turn. They asked about lockers and passing periods and how easy it was to make the basketball team. Try out and see. They asked if there were a lot of tests and group projects and if you were allowed to chew gum in class. Not supposed to, she answered, but most teachers don't care, so long as you don't stick it on the walls or in each other's hair. Other questions? Maya's hand went up halfway, barely past her chin. Maya noticed. Are the other kids, nice? She expected her classmates to scoff. Of course, Riley Flynn would ask that. But none of the other seven kids in her group laughed at her. It seemed they were just as interested in the answer as she was. Some of them, including Riley herself, had actually had gum stuck in their hair at some point. Maya hesitated. 3, maybe 4 seconds. Nearly an eternity. Then smiled again. Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, there's drama, right? It's middle school. But you're all going to do the same stuff. You have to have each other's backs. You feel me? That's what she said, but the pause hadn't escaped Riley's attention. It confirmed everything she suspected, the doubt and dread that had hit her the moment she walked through the front doors. In Maya, the cool ignorant's hesitation, Riley knew that what she was in for. This is middle school, kid, the pause said. Nobody gets out of here without a few scars. There are no more questions, she said. Who wants to go crash the cookie booth? All the hands went up except for Riley's. Because she still had one more thing she wanted to ask. Is there any way to get out of this? But she knew the answer already. Northridge was her destiny. She was trapped here for the next 3 years. And more likely than not, she would have to navigate those next 3 years alone. She tried to tell herself that it would be all right, but the feeling in her gut suggested otherwise, telling her there was no escape. Riley glanced behind her at the exit sign hanging above the door, then shoved her hands in her pockets and got into the very back of the line. 24. Riley ran a finger along the outline of the bandage on her other hand. It still hurt, a throb made worse any time she moved her thumb, though it looked as if the bleeding had finally been stanched. When she got home, she would strip off the bandage and wash the cut for real, then douse it in peroxide and let it air out for a while before rebandaging it with the proper supplies her mother stockpiled in the medicine cabinet. When she got home. The frog, Max, blinked up at her. What do you want to know? It was obvious, wasn't it? The only question that really mattered right now. How do I get out of here? And yet, if Max really was what he said he was, Riley was still trying to fully convince herself that he was. There was so much other questions that came to mind, not so much about the here and now, but about after. She'd be lying if she said she never thought about it. And if he really was a ghost, if he really had keeled over in the middle of a grocery store, then he must have some answers. He must know how it felt. Did it hurt? How much? Was it peaceful? Did you see your life flashing before your eyes, perhaps? Or was that just a cliche? Max had already said it was nothing, darkness, and then this. But then there had to be more to it than that, didn't there? There were times she wondered what it must be like, what it must be like lying in bed at night, staring up at her ceiling or through the window across the room, her parents already asleep, trying to wrap her brain around the certainty of it, and the uncertainty, this thing that would happen to anyone, everyone, that would happen to her, but could still be so arbitrary, so random, so unexpected. Sitting on your porch with a newspaper in your lap, sitting in the produce aisle with an avocado in your hand, a clogged artery, a burst blood vessel, and then boom, gone. But gone to where? Here, apparently, Northridge, home of the Panthers. She probably shouldn't be surprised. She always said that middle school was proof that hell exists, which brought her back to the most pressing questions of all. The most pressing for her, at least, right at this moment, so that's what she asked. The vessel Max occupied seemed to frown at her. Or maybe that was just his default expression. He was a frog after all, sort of. I don't know, he said. Riley raised her voice again. What do you mean you don't know? You said I was in trouble, that you could help me. I know, but getting out of here is not it. Getting out is not that easy. Yeah, tell me about it, Riley shouted. The freaking windows are stuck. The phones won't work, the doors won't open. I'm hearing all these crazy sounds and seeing things that can't be real. And then you hesitated, taking the taped up frog sitting in the flashlight's glow. A frog that had escaped from its plastic bag and then from Barnum's supply closet all on its own, even though she slammed the door shut. Frogs can't turn down doorknobs. It didn't take a herpetologist to know that. Ghosts, on the other hand. In so many of her father's stories, the ghosts never talked, but they let their presence be known in other ways. Chairs rearranged around the dining room, a drawer open that you swore you just closed, a bed lamp that blinks on and off. They can manipulate the physical world, perhaps because they never fully parted from it. That's how they exerted their will over you. That was a haunting. Riley tensed, pressing her back against the chair. Riley, Max began, as if reading her thoughts. Who could say what all the ghosts could do? But she voiced them anyway. It was you, wasn't it? Riley, listen to me. You unlocked the supply closet door. You're the one who let me out, and if you can do that, Riley remembered the window, how it suddenly slammed shut, crashing down like a guillotine, as if someone much stronger than her had been standing above, putting all their weight on it. The phones, the lights, had to be reason, there had to be a cause. Riley shook her head, pushing the chair backward, but keeping the flashlight steady in hand, trained on the frog, hunched at the edge of the desk. It was her father's stories. Some ghosts could do more than just scare you. They could manipulate you, possess you, even physically hurt you. They weren't all content to rattle doorknobs and wear white bed sheets somewhere. So some were much more powerful than that, and they all had something they wanted. Riley stood up, took a step back away from the desk. Riley, please. The windows, the doors. It's true. There are some things I can do, some things I can control, but I'm telling you, it's not what you think. How do you even know what I'm thinking? Riley yelled, hands cupped over her ears. How are you inside my head? What do you want from me? She closed her eyes, suddenly dizzy. How do you even know my name? She never said it, not out loud. At least she didn't think so. Riley, please, just hear me out. No, you tell me why you're doing this, Riley pressed. Why are you keeping me here? The flashlight shook in her hands. The floor felt like it was shifting beneath her. Maybe her legs were just about to give out. The voice inside her head, something floated. It's not me. Riley stumbled backward, forearms to her ears as a sharp pain stabbed her eyes, filled her skull, sent her reeling. But then, just as quickly as it hit her, the pain vanished, and she heard Max's voice, much softer now. It's not me, he repeated. I'm not the one holding you here. Riley knew what question came next. Before she could ask it, a bright flash illuminated the doorway. The hallway light was somehow back on. And then she heard it, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps. Somebody else was here. Riley snatched her backpack, shoving her roll of tape back in. Riley, wait, where are you going? Max called, but she didn't answer it and she didn't stop. She just circled around the desk and headed for the hallway, following the sound of retreating steps. Don't go out there, Max said, his voice pleading. It's not what you think. But all Riley could think was that someone else was in the school, a living, breathing human being. All that she could think was that this nightmare was over, and she was saved. 25. She'd only been scared, truly scared, once in her life. There were hundreds of times where she'd felt uneasy, anxious, belly sick with worry, like in the fifth grade, coming home with an F on her report card, her first mostly from missed work that she couldn't bring herself to finish, knowing her parents had probably already heard about it through an email from Mrs. Hyde, the frowns of disapproval they would wear it all night, lectures, ultimatums they would deliver. On the first day of middle school, sixth grade, the clock ticking down to fifth period, lunch period, with no plan in place for where to sit. For the next 5 weeks at that same hour until she met Emily, and then the only thing turning her stomach was the rank smell of school taco meat. And then there was a time where she was 9, standing behind the garage at Billy Denson's house with him and Kyle Blackwood. Billy holding the steak knife he'd borrowed from his kitchen, promising she could be in their club if she was willing to perform the ritual. Riley, tired of spending her summer alone, snatched the knife out of his hand. The cut across her palm hadn't even hurt that much, though it turned out not to be worth even that little bit of blood. Just to be let into Billy's basement and watch the two of them belch their way through a 2 liter of Faygo and play video games all afternoon. There were worse things than being alone, she decided. Riley was no stranger to anxiety, but anxiety wasn't the same as fear. She knew the difference too, between being afraid and being startled. She jumped at the movies when she was supposed to, when the boogeyman emerged from the closet or appeared from behind the black seat. Then wasn't real fear. That wasn't real fear. She knew. It didn't turn your blood cold. She'd only had that feeling once 3 years ago, when she'd come out of her bedroom late at night to find her mother standing in front of the television, phone pressed to her ear, her face drained of color. Riley looked past her mother to see what she'd been watching. At first, she couldn't quite make it out, just broken glass and twisted metal. As the camera panned and zoomed, though, she realized what she was looking at. The jagged hunks of metal became the fronts and backs of two freight cars that had smashed into each other. Zoomed out further, she could see more cars, some of them turned sideways, many of them scrunched together like an accordion. The flash of sirens and the black and yellow dots of firefighters swarmed the scene, showing just how serious it was. And then the part she would never forget, the engine, half on and half off the track, and the white SUV, bent into a V form from the impact, nearly severed in half. The banner headline along the bottom, deadly train crash kills two. Riley's mother didn't see her standing there at first. Gretchen was split between the horrifying images on screen and whoever had just picked up on the line. Yes, this is Mandy Flynn. Her husband is Connor Flynn. He's one of the engineers. I just saw the news. Can you please just tell him what operator was on board that CSX? Yes, I understand that. I've already tried calling him, but he's not answering. I need to know. Riley moved to get a better look at the television. Her mother stopped talking. Her free hand covered her mouth, then quickly cupped the receiver on the phone. She looked at Riley with warm, wet eyes. Go back to bed, sweetheart. Her voice sounded soft, but there was an underlying edge to it, letting Riley know this was an order, not a suggestion. Riley didn't move. Is that Dad's train? It's not Dad's train. It's... Her mother removed her hand from the phone. Yes, yes, I'm still here. Just 1 second. She turned back to Riley. I'm serious, Riley Cooper Flynn. Go back to bed right now. I'll be there in a minute. She pointed toward the hallway with a shaky finger. Reluctantly, Riley turned to go, but not before taking another glance at the news, which now showed a close-up of the wreckage and a pair of paramedics loading a body into the back of an ambulance. The next 10 minutes were the worst of Riley's life. Lying in bed, staring up at the glow-in-the-dark sticker stars that constellated her ceiling, wondering if the person in the ambulance was the same man who helped her stick up all those stars, the same one who taught her how to fish and tie a knot and blow a bubble, wondering if that person was going to make it. Finally, her door opened and her mother came in holding her phone. Someone said hi to you, she said. Her mother put her phone on speaker and her father's voice sang out, Hey there, monster, do you miss me? And in that instant, Riley's blood thawed and the fear melted away, and her mother curled up in Riley's skinny twin bed beside her as her father wished them both good night, holding her as Riley softly cried herself to sleep. Only later did she learn how close it was, that the train involved in the accident was taking the same route that her father had taken just that morning, passing through the same small town, the same intersection with its faulty wooden crossing gate that finally gave up on coming down. That the two people who died were both in the SUV, and the engineer had suffered only minor injuries. It hadn't been her father in the cab. It hadn't been her father who didn't throw the brake in time. It hadn't been her dad lying on that stretcher. She had been so scared, afraid that she might never see him again, but she had nothing to be afraid of. Her father was safe. Her father was on his way home. Only later did she think to feel guilty for feeling so relieved. 26. Riley stopped and listened for the footfalls again, sense of relief already starting to give way to uncertainty. The fluorescent lights along C Hall were blazing, though all the classrooms remained dark. She walked slowly, staying in the middle, glancing through the window of every door she passed. Okay, so what? The hall lights were the ones on before the power went out. Obviously, they would be the ones to come back on. But the power wasn't back on everywhere. Riley could see that the lights at the intersection and at the end of the hall were still off. C Hall made a single illuminated path, like a runway. Hello? Anybody there? As if in response, the lights in the adjoining hall flickered on. Oh, thank the sweet baby Jesus. She took off, her backpack slamming against her shin until he hoisted it onto her shoulders, approaching the corner at a sprint until she saw something that made her slow again. The lights in the connecting hall were all on, just the one leading off to the left. The path to the right was still dark. She remembered a poem she read in language arts last year, about two paths diverging in the woods. She could only remember the first and last line, and then the then two lines in the middle, because they stuck out to her the most. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. She liked those lines at the time. She didn't anymore. Riley's heart thumped hard against her ribs. The hallway was empty, no movement, no further sounds. But she distinctly heard footsteps. You heard a lot of things. She glanced behind her and then stepped cautiously around the corner, peering down the lit hall half of the adjoining hall. It led to another block of classrooms, rooms that, during the day, held social studies and language arts classes where poems about choices were read. At the very end sat the gym. Don't go. It was her own voice inside her head this time, but Riley glanced back over his shoulder anyway. Sea Hall, the one she left, was empty. Not just empty, it was dark again. Even though 5 seconds ago, all the overhead bulbs had been beaming. It was as if the only lights that worked were those near her, as if they were activated by her presence, or as if someone was lighting her way. Max, are you doing this? Riley whispered. But there was no response. Riley looked back towards the gym, the momentary burst of hope she'd felt as if the thought of finding a teacher or custodian slowly draining, leaving only that unsettling feeling that she was being watched. The same feeling she got when she threw those goggles on the floor today, everyone inside spinning around, staring at her as if she was some kind of aberration, all those eyes all on her. The lights overhead flickered once, as if giving her a nudge. This is a bad idea. Right. She should go back to the room she left behind. Go back to Max and force him to tell her exactly what was going on, what he'd done, what he was doing. Maybe return to the front office, see if the electricity was back on there, try the automatic door again, pull on the fire alarm, pull all the freaking fire alarms. Or maybe just light the whole stupid building on fire. Even if the alarms didn't work, surely somebody would see the smoke. She could use one of the Bunsen burners from the science room and live out the fantasy of half the student body, Northwood Middle School, up in flames. That Bradley wasn't keen on being trapped inside a burning building, and arson seemed like a measure of last resort. Plus, as creeped out as she was by the flickering lights, she still preferred them to the darkness. She stood at the intersection looking back and forth, considering her options and noticing poetry in her head, reciting poetry in her head, when she heard the footsteps again. That these were different, not the click of dress shoes on tile that she thought she'd heard earlier. This was a shuffled squeak of sneakers on the laminate floor. the sound of someone skidding to a stop on the court. It was followed by a sharper, shriller sound that was just as unmistakable, that of a whistle. Riley learned the truth when she was only 4, that some things aren't at all like you imagine them. That was when her father broke the news and nearly broke her car, at least for an afternoon. That was the day she stopped wanting to be just like him, all because of a whistle. It was a weekday morning. Riley's mother was at work, and Riley and her father were crowding in the center of the couch, watching Sesame Street, eating microwave popcorn as a sort of after-breakfast snack. Elmo was talking to a police officer about his job, and the officer was showing Elmo some of the things that he carried with him. His radio and his badge and even his handcuffs, though not his gun, Riley noticed. No firearms allowed on the street. He then showed Elmo his whistle, and they both took turns blowing it, which caused Oscar to pop up out of his can and start complaining about all the racket. Riley liked Oscar. He was her favorite. Him or Cookie Monster. Cookie Monster just got it. That's what you use? Riley asked, putting at the whistle in Elmo's furry mouth. She meant the one on the train, of course. The shrieks it made whenever it came to a crossing, the loud wailing warning that could be heard for miles. Her 4-year-old self imagined a whistle like the one Elmo was holding, but so much bigger, about the size of a watermelon, and her father pressing it to his lips, blowing so hard his cheeks puffed red and his eyes shot out of their sockets like an old cartoon. Her dad laughed. Afraid not. Trains don't have whistles anymore. We use air horns now. Real loud, obnoxious ones. Just press a button and the train honks like 100 angry geese. Honk, honk. Look out, coming through, he bellowed. He made a funny face. He was trying to make Riley laugh, but she pouted instead. It wasn't right. She thought of the wooden train whistle Santa had put in her stocking only a month ago. A skinny block of wood and her own name burned into the advanced letters. Riley. She knew it wasn't the same as the ones on real trains. Not big enough, for starters, but she had at least imagined they were related. Her wooden toy whistled around, sounded nothing like 100 angry geese, though. Not even one angry goose. I didn't like the movies they played on the carousels at the fair. Her father took in her grouchy face. I know, it bums me out too sometimes. Those old steam whistles were cool. They'd make different sounds depending on how you triggered the cord. They had personality. The air horns all sound the same, but they get the job done, most of the time. So all you do is press a button? Connor Flynn pretended to be offended. Okay, little miss, I'll have you know that I do a lot more than that. Operating a train is hard work. But I guess when it comes to that part, yeah, I just press a button. Riley gave it some thought, frowned again. I don't think I want to be a train driver anymore, she said, turning back to the television with her arms crossed, not realizing that was the first time her father had heard anything about her wanting to be an engineer to begin with. He crossed his arms and an invitation of hers. Well, in that case, neither do I, he said, tended to watch for 5 more seconds, waiting to make sure her guard was down. Then he turned and pounced, teeth bared, hands in the shape of claws, and gave her the full-on out belly attack she deserves. I'm going to be a professional monster tickler instead. Riley squirmed and squirmed. She forgave him for the tickling, but never forgot about the whistle, or how he said he missed the way they used to be. How when things changed, they didn't always change for the better. On the television, Oscar demanded that Elmo be arrested for disturbing the peace. Even at age 4, Riley knew it was impossible to get arrested on Sesame Street. Almost nothing bad ever happened there, and even when it did, it was all fixed by the time the show was over. She guessed that was probably all a bunch of baloney, too. Few things are ever as good as you hope they will be. 28. Riley made her way down the hall, the trill of the whistle echoing in her head, just like the last song played on the radio. She pulled open the gym door. She wasn't surprised to find that the overhead lights were still all on. Should I be? She wondered. And what does it mean that I'm not? Riley wasn't sure about the answer to that one, but she knew what she'd heard. That piercing shriek that usually meant that it was time to stop horsing around and pay attention as the PE teacher explained what new physical torture awaited them. Riley had despised gym class in elementary school, not because she was unathletic, a little uncoordinated maybe, but she was the third fastest girl in her class. She could do 20 push-ups, which was 19 more than some of the boys and 20 more than Twistin Wales, who bragged in fourth grade about having a six-pack even though it was just his ribs poking through. No, she hated PE because the other kids always took it too seriously. It was as if the moment they entered the gym, they became a pack of Neanderthals, hooting and grunting and baring teeth. Someone usually ended up with a bloody knee or elbow rash, and feelings were always bruised. Of course, Riley might have administered a few of those bruises herself. Like the time she ran into Caroline Silton so hard in Charbade that she knocked the girl off her scooter and then accidentally, because it was an accident, rolled over Caroline's hand, sending her to the nurse. Of course, Caroline had called her parents her pathetic for not making a shot only moments before. But nobody else in Riley's class had heard that. They only heard Caroline's wailing, shouting that Riley had broken her every finger. They could all see the ice pack that poor Caroline had on those swollen fingers for the rest of the day as well, Riley didn't miss any of the dirty looks shot her way, especially from Missy Reynolds, who was suddenly Caroline's new best friend. Thankfully, by the end of the week, Caroline's smashed digits were fine and the incident was mostly forgotten, probably because it didn't leave a mark. Leaving a mark was so much worse. Riley tucked her flashlight into the pocket of her jeans and took a few tentative steps into the gym. "Is somebody in here? Mrs. Robards?" Mrs. Robards was the only athletic coach she knew by name. She'd been Riley's sixth grade science teacher and was the one who suggested Riley try out for the tennis team instead of the soccer team. That was before the summer camp proved what a bad idea that would be. "Hello? Someone in here?" Hours ago, the gym had likely been full of sweaty bodies. Grace and her volleyball friends with their short shorts and elbow pads bumping and spiking, pointing and hollering. Now it was empty, save for a couple of wrestling mats stacked against a far wall and a rack full of basketballs that someone had left out by the bleachers. Along that same back wall sat an office, the boys and girls' locker rooms, and another set of double doors that led to the parking lot and the football field beyond. The lights to the office, as well as both locker rooms, appeared to be off. Riley crossed the court. Her boots made audible clicks with every step. You weren't supposed to wear boots like hers on the gym floor. Might leave scuff marks. Then again, you probably weren't supposed to try and break windows in the school's beloved screech culture either. Not to mention locking other students in closets and leaving them alone with a ghost frog. Not a ghost frog, Riley cried to herself. A ghost inside a frog. It was an important distinction. The frog had croaked and moved on, but Max was still here, stuck here, just like her. Or so he said. Riley stopped in front of the gym's exit, another set of doors with push bars that looked like they could only be locked from the inside. "Please, please open," she whispered, leaning her full weight into one, thinking maybe it was simply a matter of brute force, that a girl who could do 20 push-ups might just be able to muscle her way through solid metal. The door didn't give. She spat a long string of cuss words, the kind you would find scratched into the yellow paint of a bathroom stall, then leaned her head against the door. She was never getting out of here. "Why is this happening to me?" She shut her eyes and tried to imagine she was somewhere else, at home on the couch with her mom, flipping through magazines, sitting in the car with her dad, trying to teach him the words to the latest Rihanna song, slouched on the bench next to M, squinting through the brain freeze and fighting over the last chunk of Oreo, floating on a lake in the middle of the night, staring up at the stars with nobody around, anywhere but here. "Give it back." Riley's head snapped up and whipped around, taking in the empty gym, seeking the source of the voice she just heard. Max? No Max. At least not in the vessel that she'd picked for himself. But the voice was like Max's in that it was at once inside her head, yet coming from somewhere else, not so much heard as remembered. This voice, however, was a young girl's. "Give it back to me," the voice cried out again. Riley scanned the back wall, past the office with the lights still off and over the girls' locker room. The voice seemed to be coming from that direction. She shuffled towards it, pausing between each step, waiting to hear it again, until she stood a few feet from the entrance, thumbs looped through the straps of her backpack, trying to see around the corner. "Somebody there?" Riley called. "Hello?" She started to take a step inside. Thump. Riley jumped, startled, spinning to see that one of the basketballs had tumbled off the top of the cart and was now dribbling slowly across the hardwood floor, matching her heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. Each bounce smaller than the last. Thump, 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 until it began to roll toward the basket. Riley tracked her body stiff. It finally came to a stop directly underneath the net on the north side of the gym. Gust of wind, must have been. Kicked up and knocked the ball out the cart in a room with no windows. That did it. I didn't want to be in that gym any longer. She managed only one step, however, before more voices, different voices, hit her from opposite directions. Young voices, like hers, like the ones in the cafeteria that seemed to dance and circle and jab. These voices were filled with laughter, but Riley could make out words this time. "As if you need it. What a joke. Check this out." These voices all sounded like girls as well. Some like girls she knew, hauntingly familiar. Then came the same voice from before, pleading. "What are you doing? Stop. Give it back." The latter undulated, louder and then softer before rising again, coming first from the direction of the locker room, but then from all around. Riley felt her whole body listing dizzily, rocked one way and then the other. The voice continued to grow. They were boys' voice now, laughing and shouting, and the one girl's voice, louder than the rest, furious, frantic. "Here, toss it. I've got this. Just give it. Let me try. Let go." Riley's head erupted with the sound of cheering. She spun around, hands cupping her ears, until her eyes locked onto something on the north backboard, dangling from the peeling orange rim. Something that Riley clearly hadn't noticed before, because it most definitely hadn't been there before. The training bra, not that different from that kind Riley had started to wear over the summer, hanging half in and half out of the hoop. All white, except that someone had written on it in black marker across the front. The ink soaked in, making the letters dark and puffy. And even though it was hard to make out from so far away, Riley knew what it said, because she'd seen those same words scrawled somewhere else. Nothing to see here. Riley felt the quick, sharp pain behind her eyes that made them shut. Suddenly, she could picture it as clearly as any memory of her own, like a movie projected onto the inside of her skull. One girl sitting by herself at the edge of the wooden bench away from the rest. Riley could only see her from the back, the dark brown hair approaching black and longer than Riley's, the angular shoulders, the pale skinny arms, the bigger group of girls whispering, scheming behind her. The comments, cliched but cutting. Then it happens in a flash. Stop, give it back. Giggles circulate around the girls' locker room. A game of keep away. Someone produces a black marker, capital letters, bleeding into the fabric. And another girl runs out of the locker room with the bra, ruined now, waving it like a flag. The boys, basketballs already in hand, turn and stare. It takes them a minute to realize what they are looking at, to decide what to do, whether to join in or stand back. Those are the only options. No one's going to stop it. The thief hands off the bra like a baton, and the laughter transfers with it. Infectious, it spreads. It's just a joke. That's what they tell themselves. A harmless joke. The girl comes out wearing her t-shirt and jeans, tears already stinging her eyes. She can taste blood from biting the inside of her cheek. She launches herself at the pack of boys as the pack of boys reaches for her stolen bra. The boys are quicker. They pass it back and forth between them. One boy looks up and sees the hoop, calls for a pass, wads up the bra and takes a shot. He misses. The girl tries to grab it from the floor, but she's too slow. Someone snatches it out from under her. Let me try. At this time, the shot goes up and in, getting hung up on the rim. But the basket counts. Everyone cheers, loud enough to finally pull the teacher out of his office. The whistle causes the boys to scatter so no one takes the blame, leaving the girl sitting alone, underneath the basket, sick to her stomach, sobbing, broken. Nothing to see here. 29. Riley was no stranger to embarrassment. She knew how it felt to want to be somewhere else, anywhere else. Like that day at the Coles mid-May, the calendar lurching slowly but surely toward the end of the school year, the temperature inching up past 80. Riley's mother had been blessed in the mail with a 30% off coupon, which meant it was time for the Flynn's to augment their summer wardrobes. Amanda Flynn got caught up looking at breezy dresses, a far cry from her scrubs, so Riley got to wander off on her own. That's how she found herself in the swimsuit section, staring at an expensive stripy toothpaste, while also snatching furtive glances across the aisle at the shoe section, and the boy standing there. She didn't really recognize him. He was clearly older than her, a high school freshman perhaps, or even a sophomore. Curly hair, dark eyes, wearing a shirt that seemed tight on purpose. He was staring at his phone, no doubt stuck here with his parents like she was and bored out of his mind. He must have been watching something good because he smiled and laughed. Then he looked up and he caught Riley's eye. His smile held, and Riley melted just a little around the edges. He was only being polite, she knew, but even as she looked away, he imagined otherwise, that his smile was directed at her, that she had prompted it. Bikini, huh? Riley, startled, turned to see her mother standing right behind her. A woman could be so stealthy sometimes, like a ninja, a nosy, annoying ninja who constantly gives unasked for advice and nags you about leaving your wet towel on the floor. I was just looking, Riley said, her eyes darting to the boy, who was starting on his foot again, then back to her mother. She thought she was quick enough. She wasn't. Do we know him? Riley shook her head, then pretended to flip through some more swimsuit options, the one still hanging off her wrist, her back to that boy that we didn't know, hoping, praying the conversation was over. Her mom continued to steal glances at him, though. He's a hottie, she said in a knowing, under-the-breath voice. They still say that, hottie? Riley groaned, continued to flip, not even really looking, just trying to ruin her mother out. What is it then? Heartthrob? Hunk? Stud? Am I close? I'm getting colder, aren't I? Would you please stop? Riley hissed. Someone is going to hear you. Nobody's going to hear me. I had to hear you. That's enough. She glared at her mother now, careful to keep her eyes locked on, not letting them stray back to the aisle, afraid the boy might be standing there, that he might be watching them. What? Perfectly normal for you to be checking guys out, her mother whispered. I'm not checking anyone out, Riley said, changing her voice to imitate her mother's deeper tone. I don't even know him. He's just some guy. I know, of course. Her mother's voice was softer now, but more serious. Just saying, you're getting older, and things are happening, like biological things, changes. Aya's face, already warm pink, suddenly blazed a blood red. She could feel her armpits dampening. She spoke through gritted teeth, her voice a low growl. Oh my God, will you just stop? We're sitting in the middle of a freaking Coles. Her mother put a hand on her arms. You're right, of course. This isn't the time or the place. I just wanted to say that I noticed you noticing, and there are things that you wanted to talk about. None. No things. I snipped, brushing the hand off. Believe me, there's absolutely nothing that I want to talk about with you about, okay? Can we just go already? Shoved the bikini back on the rack with an unsatisfyingly angry click. She turned sharply, her head down, bangs shielding her eyes, but not so much that she didn't notice that the boy who started this whole thing was already gone. She glanced back to see if her mother was following or just letting her storm off to the car and saw her take the strap bikini back off and put it in the car. Riley spent the entire drive home not saying a word, even though part of her wanted to. Because her mother was right, though she hated to admit it. There were things Riley wanted to talk about, personal things, confusing things, private things, changes, yes. So many and all so fast. Not just the kind her mother was thinking about. Across the board, it seemed like everything was in flux, the very ground shifting under her. But these were conversations you wanted to have in her room with the door shut, sitting cross-legged on one end of the bed with a pillow in her lap, across from a friend who was just as curious and confused as she was. Except the person she had in mind didn't come and sit on Riley's bed anymore. In fact, Emily hadn't been to Riley's house in over 3 weeks. The conversations, once so rambling and easy and full of secrets and suppositions, now seemed strained. Riley couldn't bring herself to ask Emily if she thought Adrian Rosales, the new transfer student, was cute, or if she thought it was time for Riley to start wearing a trainer. She couldn't imagine talking to Emily about hormones or making out or any of the things her mother, the nurse, was prepared to give her awkward lectures about. Could imagine the uncomfortable looks that her friend, still even friends really, would give her, even though Emily was probably having all those same conversations with her other friends, the ones she sat with, laughing with, whispered with, all the time now, doing it all without her. When they got back to the house, Riley sadly got out of the car, and her mother wordlessly handed her the new bikini. Riley took it upstairs to her room, shoved it in the drawer of her dresser, still on the hanger, and slammed the door shut. Then she sat on her bed, cross-legged, staring out the window as two boys played football in the street. 30 was coming, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She could feel the surge in her belly, the ripple of upper esophagus. She looked around for a wastebasket, a cardboard box, sitting out for recycling, a container of any kind. There was another bathroom down the hall, but she knew she wouldn't make it in time. She wasn't keen on going in there after what she'd seen last time. The sick burned its way out of her, scorching her throat and filling her nose with its rotten tang, which only caused her mouth to lurch again, a second heave, splashing the floor between her feet as she doubled over, head pressed to the walls, the sound of her retching carrying down the hall. Her head pulsed, her heart pounded. What's happening to me? Riley looked down at the puddle of vomit, some of it smattering her boots. Somewhere in the pocket of her brain that still registered rational thought, she felt a twinge of guilt at the mess she made. Mr. Graham, your assistance is needed for a bazooka belly blow outside the museum. Nobody likes to lose their lunch at school. It's like the kind of thing you can be laughed at or whispered about the rest of the year. Riley the retcher tasted again Flynn. She knew how these things went. Riley wiped her chin on her sleeve and stumbled woozily towards the exit at the end of the hall, suppressing another wave of nausea. She knew it wouldn't open. Knew deep down in the pit of her now empty stomach but she tried it anyway, because she was desperate, lost, confused, alone. She didn't kick it this time. She didn't shout or curse or slam her palms against the cold metal. Instead, she let her book bag limp off her shoulders, slumping to the floor alongside it. She pressed her sweat-soaked back against the door and felt her lungs buckle as they were made of tissue, her head back, eyes closed. She thought of her mother, the phone call she'd surely missed by now. How much longer would it be till someone realized that Riley Flynn wasn't where she was supposed to be? That nobody. Riley kept her eyes closed as she drew her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them and burying her face in the gap they made. She wanted to sink into that hole and vanish, to crawl through it and appear somewhere else, on the other side of the walls. The noises were out of her head, at least. The footsteps, the shouting, the laughter, even the images were fading, which was strange because they felt so much like her own memory. So immediate and intense, and yet already they were starting to blur. She could barely even remember what the girl looked like, that poor girl standing all by herself beneath the basketball hoop. Riley could no longer conjure her face, but the anger and shame lingered, almost as tangible as the awful taste on her tongue. It had happened here, at this school, that Riley was sure of, but not in her time. The glimpse she'd been given, it was of the same gym, but there was fever banners on the wall, the paint a different shade, the scoreboard smaller and without the advertisement for Steiner's Chevrolet. Was it a memory? And if so, whose? The images had been dreamlike, fleeting, but the voice had sounded so familiar, so real. Give it back. She thought back to the writing on the bathroom stall, laughter in the cafeteria so similar to the mocking giggles emanating from the locker room. The message is the same. I told you. Riley jerked her head up, her eyes salty with tears, looked over her knees at the frog sitting on 10 feet away. She hadn't heard him approach. Only going to get worse. His voice sounded different than before, bitter, angry. Riley stared as if she was seeing him for the first time, hunched there, held together by tape, so small, so fragile. But she couldn't stop herself from shaking because she knew he was so much more. She wasn't sure what he was capable of, but she was certain what he was now. There was no point in denying it. The smell of her own sick hit her all over again. How could it get worse? Max's voice cut right through into her. You have no idea. It sounded like a threat. Randy studied the vessel hunched before her, and though she saw nothing in the frog's vacant, milky eyes, she could feel him there, so close to her, and it chilled her. It's you, isn't it? This is all your fault. Riley sat up. The rush she had felt in the gym, the surge of some other girl's anger and shame, gave way to Riley's own, her fear transforming. turning from cold to hot, taking control of her as it had too many times before. Without really thinking, she reached for her backpack and pulled it toward her, making sure she had a firm grip on each side, raising it like a soccer ball up over her head and throwing it at the ghost as hard as she could. The frog moved fast, faster than Riley would have thought possible given its skimpy leg. The backpack skidded harmlessly along the floor, missing its target by inches. Riley pulled herself to her feet, shaking off another wave of dizziness. She slammed the palm of her hand against the smooth metal behind her, keeping her eyes on Max. Open this door. I can't, Max said evenly. You're lying, Riley spat. I know what you are. I know what you can do. I know what you've done. Now open this door. I already told you. I'm not the one keeping you here. Riley twisted violently, slamming her body into the door again, pounding with both fists. Open the door. I'm sorry, Max said after a beat. I would. I want to, but it's out of my control. Riley turned and looked at Max, all her frustration and fear boiling into a white-hot anger. There was no counting, no deep breath. The frog sat less than 10 feet away, a distance she closed in three forceful strides, raising her right foot high, the thick heel of her boot poised. Riley, wait! Bringing it down quickly, but not quick enough. The dead frog jumped out of the shadow of her boot heel. You don't understand. He was inside her skull. She heard him, but she wasn't listening. Her boot came down again, stopping the empty space where Max had been only a half a second before. Let me out of here, she screamed. Listen to me, Stomp. I can't, Stomp. Stomp. You, Stomp. Go. Lily chased after the frog, frantically leaping down the hall, trying to smash him under her boot heel like a toddler squashing bugs on the blacktop, till she cornered him in the entryway of the classroom, backed against the door. Riley, please, I swear to you, it's not me. She swooped down, quickly covering him with both hands the way she'd done with a wounded rabbit 2 years ago. She could feel what remained of the frog's inside shifting beneath her fingers. She could smell the delayed decay surfacing in its leathery skin. Its bulbous white throat quivered as she squeezed harder, wondering how hard she would have to squeeze before it split right back open, right through the tape, guts spilling out over her hands, squishing beneath her fingers. What are you going to do? Mess's voice echoed in her head. Kill me? I hesitated. Go ahead. Do it. Squeeze until the eyeballs pop. Won't change a thing. I'll still be right here, stuck in the same place, and so will you. Her fingers tingled. It would be easier to snap his spine, to feel it splinter. I don't believe you. I know what you are, she repeated. I know what you're doing. You think you know, Max replied, but you're wrong. What didn't she know? That she was trapped, that she was alone, that someone was keeping her here. Someone with a power she didn't understand. But if not Max, then who? Tell me what's going on. What's happening here? What did happen here? The frog's lids closed over its hollow black eyes. The voice in Riley's head stilled. She shook him with both hands. Answer me. Outside of her own head, Riley heard the click of metal against metal coming from the far end of the hall by the gym doors. Riley knew what that clicked. She heard it dozens of times each day, enough that she learned to tune it out. But here, in the dead silence of the empty school, it was impossible to ignore. In her hand, she felt the frog twitch. Max opened its dead eyes again. She's coming, he said. She'll be here shortly. Riley laid on the cot in the nurse's station, clenching her finger, willing herself to throw up. She felt like she might. She nearly convinced herself, but her body wouldn't cooperate, not without sticking a finger down her throat, and she just didn't have the guts to go for that. The school nurse smiled politely. No doubt she knew Riley was faking it. No fever, no clammy skin, no loss of color. Just a girl with her hands on her stomach complaining of pain, trying to get out of class for some reason. A rest, presentation, forgotten homework, the nurse applied the usual remedy. Took Riley's temperature, a cool washcloth, 15 minutes on the cot in the dark. But when asked if she was feeling better, Riley mustered a pathetic moan and shook her head as she couldn't bear to open her mouth. That's when she asked if Riley wanted to call someone to come get her. There was no way the nurse could have known that was what was really wrong, what had caused Riley's stomach to ache for real. But she was right about one thing. Riley was avoiding going back to her classroom. Not because of a test or unfinished work, but because of what happened on the playground and what Riley had done about it. She could still smell it somehow. It started with the animal crackers, smuggled out of her lunchbox and brought outside. Lunch wasn't until 12:15, but fourth grade had recess at 10:30, and Riley had stomach grumbling visions of snapping the crisp heads off cracker giraffes all morning. When it was her turn for one of the playground's 6 swings, she pulled a Ziploc baggie from her pocket, keeping it mostly concealed in the flap of her jacket, sneaking lions and monkeys one at a time and chewing them slowly, imperceptibly, as she went through the motions of kicking her legs. She kept her back to the teachers and to the shouts of the kickball game in the parking lot. She tuned it all out. She couldn't see Daniel Delano whispering to his friend. She didn't know he was even there until he shouted, "Time to fly, Flynn!" grabbing both chains and pulling her back before pushing as hard as he could. She had no choice but to grab the chain as well, both hands clenched, shrieking as her legs flew out in a desperate attempt to catch the cracker she wasn't supposed to have. The bag catapulted from her lap, landing on the ground, most of its remaining contents scattered in the mulch. Riley dug in her heels, skated to a stop, and jumped from the swing, rounding on Daniel, who was laughing with his friends. Look what you did! Riley pointed to the menagerie of crackers half buried in the mulch, like dinosaurs sinking in a tar pit. Riley didn't care for Daniel Delano. He was a prankster and a cut up and was all the more popular for it. His mother sat on the board of education, and he thought that gave him a longer leash when it came to his teachers. It certainly seemed that way to Riley. The boy could get away with anything. In that moment, though, she didn't care how long his leash was or whether his mother sat. She only cared that her morning snack has been ruined. Chill, I was only playing, Daniel said. Some of the other kids from her class had gathered now, including Missy and Sharonda. Pretty soon, the little mob would get the attention of the only teacher on patrol. The girl who had been waiting for the next available swing decided she would go slide instead. Besides, food's not allowed out here, Daniel added, suddenly defensive. Butt-faced jerkwads aren't allowed out here either, Riley thought, yet here we are. You owe me a pack of animal crackers, was what she said. Daniel laughed and pointed at the ground. Just eat those. He bent down and rescued a lion from the mulch, flecks of dirt clinging to it, and pressed it up to her face. Come on, little dirt's not going to kill you. It was almost touching her lips, which were locked tight. The other kids started to giggle. Missy arched an eyebrow in expectation. Riley snatched the cracker from his hand and threw it back at him. It bounced harmlessly off his chest. Daniel laughed. Ouch. He made it seem like a joke, a game. Kids like him got away with stuff like this all the time, just messing around. Like it was her fault for not playing along. Like she was the one overreacting, and she struggled with finding someone to say that wouldn't make it worse. What she really wanted was to deck him, lay him out right there in the mulch. But she knew the penalties for fighting. Phone calls, suspensions, meeting with the principals, not to mention the looks on her parents' faces. She didn't need that, any of it. So Riley gathered up her baggie with only 3 crackers left and stalked away, ignoring the sighs of disappointment from the cluster of kids who would have rather see her at least eat the cracker if not throw a punch. Riley's whole body hummed, and the farther she walked from the swings, the worse it got. The initial anger at Daniel turning to resentment and doubt. Why did she just walk away? Why did she back down? She should have made him eat it instead. Put him in a headlock and pinned him to the ground and shoved the lead line straight up his nose. She could take him. He wasn't that much bigger than her. She retreated to the fence surrounding the playground where a few other kids were loafing, wrapping their fingers around the metal links and staring through the holes like convicts in a prison yard. Let it go, Riley. It's no big deal. It's not worth getting worked up about. Her mother's voice, calm, collected, always so reasonable. Riley looked back over her shoulder to see that Daniel and the other boys were picking the crackers off the ground, daring each other to eat them now. But that was different. They were hanging, laughing with each other. She turned back to the fence. Not worth it, not worth it, not worth it, she repeated. That's when she noticed it, the pile just on the opposite side of the chain links, well within arm's reach. Dog poop, black as tar, and shaped sort of like a croissant, still fresh judging by the pungent whiff she got when she bent down to inspect it. It looked like a little bit like fate. Riley looked at the Ziploc bag clenched tight in her hand. When the whistle blew 5 minutes later and the kids gathered by the door, Riley kept a straight face, despite the load weighing on her jacket pocket. She'd been careful not to touch it, inside outing the bag first and using it as a glove, only smearing a little in the collection process. But the thought of the sealed bag and what was inside, magically soft and repugnant, filled her with dread and a sort of sickly satisfaction. Daniel's cubby was only two down from hers, with his Avengers backpack dangling from the hook and his jacket balled up underneath. As luck would have it, the main pocket of the backpack was already partially unzipped, providing easy access. She waited until most of the other kids had put their jackets away and took advantage of the post-recess chaos, the sharpening of pencils, slamming of desks, to make her deposit, prying open the baggie and squeezing from the bottom, feeling the dog turd stumble free. She could make it worse, she thought. She could give the backpack a good hug, guaranteeing maximum coverage, but that seemed like a step too far. Instead, she calmly disposed of the baggie, tucking it in the trash can, making sure to bury it under some used tissues and Mrs. Landry's Starbucks cup. Then she just as calmly washed her hands as the classroom sink, using 2 healthy squirts of antibacterial soap, citrus scented, and took her seat. Daniel Delano's desk was in the opposite corner of the room. He had his back to her, but she could see him just fine. She waited for him to look around. She wanted him to catch her eye, to see how composed and collected she was, to see that she was over it, bygones and whatever. Be her alibi, that cool expression when she had to deny all wrongdoing. And yet, as she sat there listening to Mrs. Landry yammer about fractions, Riley felt an itch work its way up the back of her legs and down along her arms. She sniffed once, twice, looked around the room. Did Missy Reynolds just wrinkle her nose? Riley could smell it. She brought her fingers up to her face, but only that whiff of orange zest and glycerin. It wasn't on her, but it was all around her. She glanced back at the cubbies. It was definitely getting stronger, seeping out, permeating the air. How could the other kids not smell that? Ajay Patel sneezed. Riley kept her hands pressed to her cheeks so that she could keep the soapy scent close. But it was no use. The stench of fresh dog feces haunted her, made her stomach tight. The smug smile she'd been wearing since she came in from recess vanished. This was a mistake. She felt it. There was no taking it back now, even if she wanted to. There was no way she could fish out the turd out of Daniel's backpack without him, or someone, at least, knowing. The only way to undo what she'd done was to own up to it, to raise her hand and confess. Maybe Miss Landry would be lenient, especially if she told the teacher what Daniel had done to her on the playground. Riley considered herself a principled person. She raised her hand. Yes, Riley. Miss Landry leveled her with a slightly suspicious stare, then wouldn't throw up. Can I go to the nurse? And so there she found herself, lying on a cot with an uncomfortably moist washcloth on her forehead and something foul gnawing away at her insides, wondering if anyone in her fifth-grade class had discovered the source of the smell yet, wondering if Mrs. Landry had peered in Daniel's backpack herself and made him do it, wondering if her mother would come to get her in time to escape before the you-know-what hit the fan. The problem with principles is that sometimes they contradict each other. One tells you to stand up for yourself. The other tells you to turn the other cheek. The other says, one says to own up to your mistakes. The other says to stay out of trouble. Sometimes the right thing to do isn't always the best, and Daniel really had asked for it. Riley heard a familiar voice, talking to the nurse on the other side of the curtain. She could see her mother's white Converse sneakers underneath. She was here. Riley, for the moment, was saved.